A Texas jury has officially reached a unanimous verdict in the trial of Karmelo Anthony, finding the 19-year-old guilty of first-degree murder after just 3 hours of deliberation. For weeks, the central debate surrounding the tragic track meet stabbing of Austin Metcalf focused on whether a smaller, trapped teenager acted in pure survival instinct. But when the final doors closed, the 12 jurors completely rejected the self-defense argument. In this video, we are bypassing the rumors and looking strictly at the official courtroom facts, the legal parameters of Texas law, and the exact reasons why the jury decided this case was an act of murder rather than survival. Here is the objective truth of how the verdict was reached. If you want more real courtroom breakdowns without the rumors, please hit subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases right now. Let's get back into the facts. On June 9th, 2026, closing arguments finally wrapped up at the Collin County Courthouse in McKinney, Texas. You could feel the weight of what was about to happen. Judge John Roach Jr. read the final instructions and handed the case over to the jury. Now, if you follow legal cases, you know that waiting for a verdict is usually a long, drawn-out process. You expect people to debate, to argue over the evidence, maybe come back the next day or even a week later. But that isn't what happened here. Rather than agonizing over the decision for days or signaling any sort of internal division, the jury came back into that courtroom with a unanimous guilty verdict in just 3 hours. Wow. In the context of a first-degree murder trial, a 3-hour deliberation is an exceptionally fast turnaround. It really says a lot about what went on in that deliberation room. It indicates that the 12 jurors found the state's evidence to be completely clear and overwhelming. There was no room left for a hung jury, and there was no extensive disagreement among the peers. The speed of this decision means the jury was not confused or split on how the law applied to the facts. They instantly agreed that the state had met its heavy burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, decisively rejecting the defense's narrative that the stabbing was legally justified. Before we dig deeper into the legal strategies, we really have to pause and center on the human reality of this case. At the end of the day, when you strip away the legal jargon and the courtroom procedures, you have to remember that Austin Metcalf was just a 17-year-old kid. He was a student at Memorial High School who simply went to a track meet to compete, like thousands of high school kids do every single week. His family expected him to come home that evening. Thinking about what his parents have had to endure over the last year is just heartbreaking. They lost their son in a matter of seconds over an altercation that absolutely did not need to happen. We have to speak about this with the genuine respect and empathy his family deserves. And on the other side of the courtroom, you have Karmelo Anthony. He was also just 17 years old when this happened. Now at 19, his life is permanently altered, defined forever by a single irreversible action he took that afternoon. You look at a situation like this and you just see two families entirely shattered, right? It is an absolute tragedy across the board, and the gravity of two teenage lives being lost and ruined is something we always need to keep at the forefront of this discussion. To understand how the jury arrived at this heavy conclusion so quickly, it is necessary to examine the physical evidence and the witness testimonies exactly as they were presented on the official record. The whole trial essentially boiled down to the events of April 2nd, 2025. This all took place at David Kuykendall Stadium during a Frisco Independent School District track meet. According to the court records, it was a fairly normal day until a sudden, intense Texas rainstorm moved in. It started pouring rain, and naturally, athletes and spectators started scrambling to find any kind of shelter they could to stay dry. Police reports and witness testimonies state that Karmelo Anthony, who was a student at Centennial High School, was trying to get out of the rain. The court heard that Centennial High reportedly did not have a designated team tent set up nearby. So, Karmelo sought cover under a pop-up canopy tent that belonged to Memorial High School. Austin Metcalf was already under that tent with his teammates. Based on all verified accounts, these two teenagers did not know each other prior to this exact moment. They were just two kids whose paths crossed solely because of the sudden weather change. From the moment Karmelo stepped under that tent Two very different legal narratives emerged in the courtroom. Let's look at the defense's side first. The defense attorneys argued that Karmelo was immediately confronted by a hostile group of rival athletes. They painted a picture of fear and chaos. Defense attorney Mike Howard maintained that the situation escalated incredibly fast and that Karmelo felt completely cornered. I see how they tried to build that narrative for the jury. If you look at the physical facts presented in court, Karmelo was listed at 5'8" and roughly 130 pounds, while Austin and his teammates were significantly larger athletes. The defense argued that Karmelo, feeling trapped and physically threatened by a much larger individual in a space full of strangers, deployed a pocket knife in a frantic split-second decision just to protect himself. They positioned the event to the jury as a tragic, terrible outcome, but one that was a legally justified response to an immediate, overwhelming physical threat. Conversely, you have the prosecution's side of the story. Collin County District Attorney Bill Werski and his team stepped up and completely pushed back on the idea of a scared kid defending himself. They argued that Karmelo was actually the primary aggressor who instigated the fatal encounter. To prove this, the prosecution didn't just rely on theories, they presented multiple witness testimonies. The court heard from witnesses who stated that Karmelo wasn't just standing there quietly. According to the testimony, Karmelo was actually asked to leave the Memorial High School tent by Austin and other athletes up to 15 times. Think about that for a second. 15 times. The prosecution pointed out that instead of just walking away into the rain or finding another place to stand, Karmelo flat out refused to leave. Witnesses testified that he then verbally escalated the tension. People under the tent told the court that Karmelo started saying things like, "Touch me and see what happens," and "touch me and find out." The state used these specific witness quotes to argue that Karmelo was not looking for a way out. He was drawing a line in the sand and inviting a physical confrontation. This is where the legal parameters really start to tighten. The state argued that when the physical altercation finally did happen, Karmelo utilized a hidden weapon to launch an unjustified attack on an unarmed victim. The police confirmed that Austin Metcalf did not have a weapon. The prosecution told the jury that you cannot bring a deadly weapon into what is essentially a teenage shoving match, use it to take a life, and then claim you were just defending yourself. In the eyes of the law, the state argued pulling that 3.5-inch blade effectively nullified any legal claim to self-defense Karmelo might have had. You simply cannot be the one who verbally provokes a fight, refuses to retreat, escalates the violence with a lethal weapon, and still hide behind the shield of self-defense. When you put all of this together, that 3-hour deliberation makes perfect sense. It demonstrates clearly that the jury listened to both sides and entirely accepted the prosecution's timeline and their interpretation of the events. They had to weigh the defense's claim of genuine fear against the prosecution's hard evidence of verbal provocation and refusal to leave. Ultimately, the jury determined that the physical actions taken by Karmelo Anthony met the strict statutory definition of first-degree murder. They looked at the law, they looked at the facts, and they made their choice without hesitation. This fast-track verdict officially shifted the legal standing of the case. It moved it from a heavily debated, tragic altercation into a definitive, formal criminal conviction. And it serves as a massive legal reminder about how self-defense laws actually operate in the real world. You can't just claim fear. The court looks at every single action, every spoken word, and every choice made leading up to the fatal moment. Why didn't Texas stand-your-ground laws protect the defendant? This is the core legal question that dominated the entire trial. And honestly, it's the main reason so many people online are still arguing about this case. The defense team really leaned into this strategy. They stood up in front of the court and argued that because Texas is a stand-your-ground state, Karmelo Anthony had absolutely no legal duty to run away or retreat when he was confronted under that Memorial High School rain tent. Now, if you look at how Texas law is written, an individual generally does not have a duty to retreat before using force in self-defense, assuming they have a legal right to be present at that location in the first place, right? The defense built their whole case on that exact premise. They told the jury that Karmelo had every right to be under that tent to get out of the pouring rain, just like any other student at the track meet. Because he had a right to be there, they argued he was legally permitted to stand his ground the exact moment Austin Metcalf initiated physical contact by giving him a two-handed shove. To the defense, Karmelo was cornered, he was within his legal rights, and he didn't have to run. But the prosecution was completely prepared for this argument, and they countered it by bringing up a critical exception that a lot of people overlook when they talk about stand your ground laws. They pointed directly to Texas Penal Code Section 9.31. This statute explicitly states that a person cannot claim self-defense if they provoked the difficulty. In plain English, if you helped start the trouble, you can't use the law as a shield when things go wrong. Right. Furthermore, under Texas law, self-defense is not legally justified if the defendant actively escalates a non-lethal situation into a lethal one. To prove that Karmelo provoked the situation, the prosecution brought multiple student witnesses to the stand. The court heard testimony that Karmelo didn't just walk into the tent for shelter. He stayed in that rival school's tent after being told to leave roughly 15 times. By flat out refusing to exit and by issuing those verbal challenges like, touch me and find out, the state argued that Karmelo directly contributed to the hostile environment. He wasn't just a passive bystander trying to stay dry anymore. More importantly, the prosecution demonstrated that by pulling out a 3.5-inch folding blade during what was, up to that point, a strictly physical but completely unarmed dispute, Karmelo became the primary escalator of violence. The jury's ultimate verdict indicates that they legally agreed with the state. They determined that this verbal provocation and the introduction of the knife completely stripped away his right to claim he was just an innocent kid standing his ground. This leads us directly into the second massive legal debate of the trial, and it's a heavy one. How exactly is a jury supposed to weigh a massive physical size difference against a deadly weapon? The defense heavily emphasized the physical metrics of the two teenagers, and these are verified, undisputed facts on the court record. Austin Metcalf was a 6'1", 215-pound varsity football linebacker. He was a big, strong kid. Karmelo Anthony, on the other hand, was 5'8" and weighed only about 130 pounds. The defense team put those numbers up for the jury to see and claimed that this huge 85-pound weight disparity, combined with the sudden physical shove from Austin, created a completely reasonable fear in Karmelo's mind. They argued that he genuinely believed he was facing imminent death or serious bodily injury. From their perspective, given the sheer size mismatch under that dark, crowded tent, Karmelo using his pocket knife wasn't an act of malice. They argued it was a desperate, necessary measure to neutralize a physical threat from a significantly larger, stronger opponent who was advancing on him. If you haven't subscribed to U.S. Crime Cases yet, please hit that button now so you can stay updated on the official facts of this trial. But when it came time to deliberate, the jury ultimately rejected that size mismatch argument entirely. It all came down to the legal standard of proportionality. Under Texas law, to justify using lethal force in self-defense, the threat you are facing must be imminent, it must be life-threatening, and your response has to be proportional to the danger, right? The prosecution hammered home the fact that Austin Metcalf was completely unarmed. He had no knife, no gun, nothing. The core legal debate for the jury centered on whether an unarmed shove, even from a 215-pound football player, legally justifies a fatal response with a knife. The state successfully argued that while Austin's physical push was absolutely an assault, it was a non-lethal assault. By introducing a deadly weapon into a hands-on, fists-only altercation where no other weapons were present, Karmelo utilized what the law calls a force multiplier. That weapon far exceeded a reasonable proportional response to being pushed. The jury ultimately decided that an 85-pound weight disparity alone does not inherently transform an unarmed physical altercation into a life-and-death struggle. Because it didn't, introducing a knife was viewed by the law as an illegal escalation of force rather than true survival. We also have to talk about another major point of contention that happened inside that courtroom, which was whether it was legally fair for the judge to allow the jury to see the graphic school resource officer body cam footage and the autopsy photos. This was a highly contested moment during the trial. The defense fought hard to keep those images out of the courtroom. They argued to Judge Roach that the footage and the photos were overly prejudicial. They claimed the state was only showing them to emotionally shock the jurors, break them down, and bias them against Karmelo from the very start. Wow, you can only imagine how incredibly painful that entire portion of the trial was for Austin Metcalf's family. Sitting in that gallery, having to sit through the cold, clinical descriptions of their son's final moments, and knowing those graphic images of his fatal injury were being passed around to a room full of strangers. It's a level of grief that no parent should ever have to experience, and the courtroom film felt incredibly heavy during those days. Ultimately, Judge Roach ruled to allow the evidence to be shown to the jury. He agreed with the prosecution that the footage and photos were legally necessary. The state had a legal burden to prove the exact cause of death and the precise physical nature of the injury to the jury. This evidence ended up being absolutely critical for the state's case. It didn't just show that Austin died, it established the exact mechanics of the stabbing. It showed the jury the precise angle, the depth, and the sheer level of physical force utilized by the defendant. The prosecution used those graphic details to argue that this wasn't a blind, accidental poke in the dark by a scared child. They used it to show a deliberate, forceful strike, which helped cement the first-degree murder charge in the minds of the jurors before they even walked back to deliberate. So while the defense really hammered hard on that physical size mismatch we just talked about, the prosecution had an entirely different focal point for the jury. They knew that relying solely on witness memory can sometimes be tricky, so they brought in the forensic breakdown of the Frisco ISD surveillance footage. And honestly, this is what ultimately dismantled the defense's entire timeline of how the stabbing happened. Now, if you look at the actual surveillance video from David Kuykendall Stadium that day, police said it was incredibly blurry. It was pixelated, raining, and shot from a distance. It definitely wasn't some high-definition movie where you can clearly see everyone's faces. But that's exactly where forensic video analysis comes into play in modern courtrooms. Investigators took that footage, cleaned it up as much as legally allowed, and were able to pinpoint the exact timing and the specific movements of the altercation that happened under that Memorial High School tent canopy. When you hear about this next part, you really have to take a step back and think about the human reality of the families involved. The tape showed that the actual physical interaction between these two teenagers lasted less than 10 seconds, right? 10 seconds. In the time it takes you to tie your shoes or check a text message, Austin Metcalf's life was taken and Karmelo Anthony permanently destroyed his own future. Wow. It's just an incredibly heavy reality to process when you realize how fast it all went down. This narrow 10-second window of time was heavily scrutinized during the trial. Both sides played that footage over and over for the jury. The defense wanted the jury to see the chaos, but the prosecution used those 10 seconds to demonstrate something entirely different. They pointed out to the court that instead of retreating, stepping back, or just trying to keep his distance after that initial physical shove from Austin Metcalf, Karmelo Anthony actively moved forward. In a self-defense claim, the direction your feet are moving matters immensely. The footage, along with the corresponding physical evidence from the scene, showed that Karmelo advanced toward Austin before the fatal injury occurred. The prosecution told the jury, "Look at his feet. Look at his movement. He wasn't running away. He was stepping into the fight." I see how that specific detail makes a massive difference when you are trying to prove you were just a terrified kid trying to escape. To back up what the video showed, the state then called Collin County Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Elizabeth Ventura to the witness stand. This is always the most somber, difficult part of any murder trial. You have a medical professional clinically breaking down the loss of a human life. You have to imagine the intense pain of Austin's parents sitting right there in the gallery having to listen to the details of how their son passed away. We really need to hold space for what that family went through during this testimony. Dr. Ventura testified specifically regarding the nature of the fatal injury. She informed the jury that the injury was severe and could not be survived. Hearing those words spoken out loud in a quiet courtroom carries so much weight. The prosecution used this expert medical testimony, combined with the forensic video analysis, to argue their main point. Karmelo's forward motion and the severity of the wound demonstrated a deliberate, intentional physical action. The state argued that you don't accidentally cause a fatal injury by simply flailing around defensively. They told the jury that this specific forward motion, followed by a forceful strike, showed a clear intent to attack, rather than a frantic instinct to just escape a larger aggressor. And based on the Speedy 3-hour verdict, the jury agreed. The 10 seconds captured on that pixelated tape ultimately proved to the 12 jurors that the physical response was calculated force rather than a desperate, chaotic defensive maneuver. With the first-degree murder conviction officially secured, the trial didn't just end there. In Texas, trials are bifurcated, meaning they are split into parts. So the court moved immediately into the sentencing and punishment phase. This is where things get very complicated from a legal standpoint. Because Karmelo Anthony was 17 years old at the time of the April 2020-25 incident, capital punishment is legally barred. The United States Supreme Court ruled years ago that you cannot execute someone for a crime they committed while they were a juvenile, even if they are charged as an adult. However, because he was convicted of first-degree murder, he now faces a wildly stringent punishment range. The jury has to decide if he should get anywhere from 5 to 99 years or life in prison. During this punishment phase, the defense attorneys tried one last legal strategy. They asked the jury to deeply consider the legal clause of sudden passion. If you aren't familiar with Texas law, sudden passion is a specific defense used during sentencing. Defense attorney Mike Howard argued that if the jury believed Karmelo committed this terrible act under the immediate influence of sudden emotion, panic, or extreme terror caused by the provocation of being shoved by a massive football player, they could legally reduce his sentencing range. If the jury agrees that he acted out of sudden passion, that 5 to 99-year window suddenly drops down to a range of 2 to 20 years. The defense pleaded with the jury to look at Karmelo's age, the sudden nature of the fight, and the fact that he was essentially a scared kid who made the worst possible decision in a matter of seconds. They asked for mercy, hoping the jury would understand the human element of fear, even if they didn't legally excuse the murder. The prosecution, meanwhile, was not having any of it. District Attorney Bill Werski maintained that a lengthy prison sentence is the absolutely only appropriate outcome for this conviction. They reminded the jury that Austin Metcalf doesn't get a second chance, he doesn't get to grow up, and his family is serving a permanent sentence of grief. The state argued that you cannot reward a defendant with a lighter sentence when they were the ones who brought a knife to a fistfight, provoked the situation, and refused to walk away when they had the chance. Following the reading of the guilty verdict, the reality of the situation fully set in. Judge Roach formally announced that Karmelo Anthony's bond was extinguished. He was no longer allowed to go home. The judge remanded him immediately into the custody of the Collin County Sheriff's Office. Police officers approached Karmelo right there in the courtroom, placed him in handcuffs, and escorted him out of the room. He was taken directly to the local county jail, where he will sit in a cell and await his eventual transfer to a Texas Department of Criminal Justice Intake and Diagnostic Center. After he is processed there, he will be moved to a state prison facility to serve out whatever time the jury ultimately decides during this punishment phase. When we look back at this entire tragedy, the rapid 3-hour verdict reveals a very hard truth about the justice system. It shows that when a jury is faced with the choice between a physical size mismatch and the introduction of a lethal weapon, the law strictly and consistently demands proportionality. The jury decided very clearly that an unarmed push does not justify a fatal strike, no matter how big the other person is. This case leaves us with so many heavy thoughts about youth, violence, and the permanent consequences of split-second decisions. Now that the legal record is officially set and the facts are out in the open, what is your assessment of the jury's final decision? Do you think the rapid verdict was the right call based on the law, or do you think the size difference should have carried more weight? Drop your analytical thoughts in the comments below, and please keep the space respectful for everyone involved. Thank you for staying till the end. If you appreciate strictly factual breakdowns without the rumors, please hit subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases right now.